Welcome to Ride to Success, the podcast that takes you on a learning journey to a more productive, creative, and active life. Today, I chatted with Pat Hayes, the owner and manager of the Doltcini O'Shea team. He's also the Executive Director of Regeneration, Housing and Environment in the Slough Council, UK. Obviously, he has a passion for cycling, and his journey is marked by significant roles within the local government and the cycling community. He first started to get involved in racing through his own daughter that started going through the ranks from junior to amateur level, and that's how Doltcini O'Shea team come about. In the podcast, Pat talks about the way cities should be structured, the role of women in competitive cycling, and much more. Join me as I explore Pat's journey and commitment to elevating women's cycling on the global stage. But before, ladies and gentlemen, please remember to subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to. Helps it grow massively and bring more guests to the podcast. Now, back to the podcast. Welcome, Pat, to Ride to Success. It's a pleasure having you here on the podcast. You have a huge experience in local government, but also you have a passion for cycling, and you have it not just for riding bikes, but for managing Doltcini O'Shea cycling team, which we'll get into later. But I'm kind of interested in starting the conversation with the work you do for Slough Council. And there is a post that you where you wrote, the only way to reduce traffic congestion is to get people on bikes. And obviously for me, when I read this, kind of like you're preaching to the converted here. But from your extensive experience, what do you see as the biggest challenges and opportunities in urban regeneration today?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the UK, the biggest challenge in many ways is the dominance of the car, and our obsession with car-based transport, and a lack of willingness to compromise and see the car as part of a broader travel infrastructure. We've seen lack of investment in public transport, particularly in the railways. Underinvestment in bus operation outside London. Bus transport is privatised, not particularly effectively run. And in the UK, I mean, I think the danger is that we increasingly gone down a sort of US route of low wage, low terrible tax, low public sector investment, and again, everything is very much ordered around the individual, and the car is something that people sit in. They don't interact with the rest of the community. You are in your metal box, and more of the public realm essentially has been given over to the car. And now we're in this sort of dichotomy where everyone goes, oh, yeah, traffic congestion is terrible, air quality is terrible. What are we going to do about that? And the only way we can actually change that is change the way that we move around. And that's by investing in rail, in trams, and particularly in getting people to walk and cycle more. And if people walk and cycle more, that's got so many other benefits. You've seen in places like Waltham Forest where investment in cycling infrastructure, huge economic benefit, despite at the start everybody saying, oh, this is going to kill the local shops and everything because people can't park and they can't drive there. In reality, people who walk and cycle spend more money, they're far more impulse buys because they can just stop and get on. They don't have to go and park the car. Improvements in air quality, improvements in safety because more people are walking, the streets are more active rather than people just driving past in cars. So you get passive surveillance, and I think we really need to reinvent our approach to urbanism in the UK. I've always been a strong admirer of Jan Gehl and what they did in Denmark and have done elsewhere, and he's even put his ideas into operation in Australia, which is very much like the UK, very car-orientated sort of society. So I think that if we're going to really tackle the environment in our towns and cities, we have got to reallocate road space. We've got to provide space for walking and cycling so it's a safe activity that everybody can do. And once you get that critical mass and it becomes accepted, then you can be a cyclist, you can be a car driver. At the moment, we have this sort of strange sort of culture war where somehow being a cyclist is seen as being a negative thing, and and there is this separation. I'm a cyclist and a motorist, and a pedestrian. Most of us do everything. I'm a train passenger,
exactly.
whatever that, and you don't have separate sort of this sort of conflict between the two. And we have got to look, I think, in our urban spaces as the car is not necessarily the enemy, but it should be treated as the guest because it is a big, unfriendly, hostile vehicle. That and you look at the number of people who are killed on the roads in the UK.
Yeah, I've seen some numbers, and they're terrible.
It's thousands of people. Yeah, anything else was causing that, there would be government intervention to stop it and prevent it. Everyone would be clamouring for it. But we strangely seem to tolerate that, and we tolerate all the other benefits. And the car's got huge benefits in many ways, and it's very appropriate in certain settings, whether that's rural settings, whether that's long distance travel between certain locations, etc.
Exactly.
But we've got to sort of change our approach, I think, and we've got to become more European in our approach to the public realm, because if they can do it in Paris, they can do it in London. But I think we have drifted into a sort of US form of thinking, and that's probably not helpful.
So what actually, you mentioned Paris, because Paris has been quite recently a lot in the news. What lessons can we learn from what Paris did in the city?
Yeah, I think that even in a city which is very, very car orientated, capital of the car industry, Renault at Billancourt and all these other places, that with bold political action and not doing anything which really disadvantages motorists at all, and in some ways actually has improved traffic flow, that you can get people walking and cycling again, you can get people onto scooters, you can get people moving around the city in a totally different way, which actually in the long term has benefits for motorists and people who need to use cars and people who are using vehicles, for beneficial reasons, whether that's deliveries or whatever, and I think that's the example of Paris, that you can do it anywhere. And because people always just said, you can, it works in the Netherlands because the Dutch are particularly sociable people, or and it's flat, and the same with the Danes. But if you can do it in Paris, I think you can do it anywhere. And it's the same in Seville as well. I think, again, Spanish, like their cars, not driving very fast, but in Seville, you've seen the change being made.
So there is mobility, that plays a huge role in. You have to create the infrastructure to allow people to see the potential of it and kind of give them the choice. Because if they don't have the choice of, that's a safe choice to use the roads as people riding their bikes, commuting to work, or pedestrians feeling safe in the walking on the pavement, then there won't ever be a change in the mindset.
There's got to be a physical intervention. There's got to be a reprioritizing of space. But if you're going to get people walking and cycling, you've got to provide separate space for pedestrians, separate space for cyclists, and separate space for cars and vehicles. And that, just as you wouldn't expect to run a train down the middle of a road, no more should you expect to run bike lane down the middle, of cyclists and mixed with traffic. They're just different entities. And I think that's part of the challenge, and they should all be seen as complementary. And we should need to get away from this sort of sense that, all the road space, all the space between buildings should all be allocated to one particular mode. You need to allocate it and invest. And actually investment in walking and cycling is very low cost. You get a lot of segregated cycle lane for the cost of a kilometre of motorway. So it's a win-win economically as well. If you look at the benefits, because not only do you get the the transport benefits, you get the health benefits, all sorts of other things. So that a very strong economic case. But certainly in the UK, we've got sort of bogged down in our thinking, I think, and we're sort of stuck in a mindset.
Do you think that's because car lobbyists, petrol lobbyists have more power or influence over local government decisions, or is that?
I'm not necessarily not over local government. I think they might set the tone in the national media to a degree, and what you do see at a local level is that and change is always difficult, and people are always resistant to change. And I think that's the problem. That you see it time and time again. You've seen it in Kensington and Chelsea with the removal of a lot of the cycling infrastructure and the sustainable transport infrastructure. That people are very, very defensive, and people are very resistant to change, and they don't think, well, actually, this could make life better. And so I think we have got into this sort of situation in the UK where somehow it's sort of the them and us thing, rather than we're all in this together effectively, and improving the way our cities work benefits us all. And there does seem to be a slightly sort of defensive mentality engendered in, I would say it's not really a motoring community, but it's in among certain people who use their cars feel this must be a negative, when in fact it might actually be a positive. And that's I think the difficulty. Whether that's engendered by the motoring industry, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, as you rightly said, change is difficult. Change can be also frightening for people because they don't know how that can impact. But you have mentioned the examples of Seville, Paris, where that positive change is possible. And perhaps that's kind of, that maybe is an example that we living in UK need to look up to in order how can we learn from them.
I think your political system and the way your political system is organised as well, because clearly if you're an elected mayor of a big city, you can take bolder decisions. The problem in local authorities in the UK is we have this system where councillors are elected in small wards. So therefore a very small number of people can affect whether they get into power or not, or whether they lose their job. And that therefore makes it much harder to deliver change, because people are much more worried about a smaller number. If you're a mayor of a big city of several million people, actually, if some people are upset, but the majority, may not be affected by it, happy, you're unlikely to lose your position, and you've got greater ability to, I think, to deliver change. And I think that's one of the problems with our electoral system, the way it's that first past the post system and everything else, that. And again, it's interesting, the US is that, the two sort of cultures that have the greatest difficulty with this are the US and the UK, which have this sort of outdated electoral system, which means delivering change is harder, I think.
Yeah, so that from what you're telling me, that sounds like local governments, local councils kind of have more power than bigger cities, perhaps even national government at national government level.
Well, I think it's the other way around. I think the big cities have, as a mayor of a big city, you've got more power and you can do more things. The problem in the UK that we've got a very decentralised, broken down system of local government with lots of quite small local authorities. One, that means they haven't got the money to deliver it, and that's the other big challenge. In reality, is in the UK, because we have gone down this route of low tax, low public service, there isn't the money there to make the sort of strategic interventions that you can make in, well, even in Colombia, actually, which is almost a developing country. They've been able to really commit money into alternative infrastructure, and I think that's our challenge as well. That our model of funding local government, local government don't get to keep the taxation from business, and you get a part of that. They, rely, to a very degree on directly from council tax rather than any government grant, all of which mitigates against being able to deliver ambitious infrastructure projects. And that's, I think, part of the problem. Our lack of regional governments in large parts of the country has the same effect. So I think we are uniquely hampered by our political system and by our structure.
So, well, that's there's not a very pretty picture. If local governments and councils have their hands tied because they don't want to lose the next elections. Two, they have their budget is already quite constrained, and the income that they're getting is very little. Then making big changes is perhaps out of their kind of plan. because
I think you do. You
will
definitely
create waves that they will not necessarily want.
Need strategic government intervention to get in the way that government puts money into other areas of the economy. Government would have to intervene and say, we are giving local authorities X amount of money for, and we're going to possibly increase taxes to fund this or make cuts elsewhere to fund this for walking and cycling infrastructure. It's the only way you're going to get a step change in the UK. So you need a bold national government, effectively, who says that this is a priority for improving society, improving health outcomes, improving the economy, which to a degree is what happened in the Netherlands, actually. If you think the Netherlands in the 1970s was a bit like Britain is now, it was quite car dominated, the sort of, that urban realm that you see now in the Netherlands wasn't there and it hasn't always been there. That was consciously put in place and is continuing to be consciously put in place by ongoing investment. We really just need a government to say that, we're not going to possibly spend any more money on major motorway projects. We're going to divert that all into funding local authorities to bring in, walking and cycling provision, which is taking, to one side from the existing highway provision.
Yeah. So it sounds like that you already have a plan. Like it sounds like from what you're saying, there is a clear way of doing this is by allocating that budget and shifting it towards walking and cycling.
Yeah. And we saw the success of that in London with the various mini Holland schemes in London. Under when Boris Johnson was mayor.
Yes,
ironically, and that did deliver real change in those places that got that money. Malvern Forest is the best example, but other boroughs like Ealing, significant change through the mini Holland programme. So it does show you can do that, and if you did that on a national level, huge impact. You'd obviously target it at places where it had more effect and greater need and greater concentration of population. To a degree, they've managed it in Brighton, and so it's there are examples that this can happen. It can make a fundamental change.
I mean, so can you just for the people that listening, can you just explain a bit more what is the mini Holland project so that people can understand what you're referring to?
This was a funding programme that Transport for London put in place effectively, where they invited boroughs to bid for a large chunk of capital money for essentially walking and cycling schemes. The title is slightly trite. Obviously, Holland is part of the Netherlands, but that was the idea, was to create. And I think probably the best example was Waltham Forest, where they did quite an ambitious programme, and it was quite strong resistance to it at the time, but it's actually been totally transformational for the borough in terms of its economic regeneration, its house prices and everything else have been driven upwards by the fact that they reclaimed Walthamstow Village
road space.
Road space. Prevented rat running. People could still access and park their cars and go to where they live, but it prevented rat running. Introduced lots of segregated provisions, so people started to walk and cycle. You see cargo bikes in parts of Waltham Forest, which you wouldn't have seen in London years ago. It was incomplete. It didn't cover the whole borough, but that was an example of what could be done, and that was done to a lesser degree in a number of other boroughs through that programme. So I think that remains the model. And again, at the same time, when Boris Johnson actually had quite an innovative transport advisor at the time who was behind the cycle superhighway on the embankment and things like that. So again, that reallocation of road space there, and again, a lot of complaints at the time, but the embankment works just as well as a road as it ever did. But you've now got all that, people, the numbers of people commuting into town, and again, because through places like I cycle through Bloomsbury every day, and as an old school cycle commuter who was used to just being myself and a few cycle couriers 30 years ago, and you just dodge the vans and things like that. Now you're in a queue of traffic on a segregated cycle lane, which you think, this is a bit frustrating because 20 years ago I could have weaved through the buses and the transit vans. Great risk to myself, but and I was much younger and faster in those days. But but you think now that's
Yeah,
a
but it
real
goes to
problem.
prove that that if you create it,
If you create it,
their
people will
infrastructure
ultimately use it, and
will
that's
use
the,
it.
So there were a lot of lessons from what's happened in London. I'm sure there are lessons similar in other cities like Manchester, which I know less well. You can do this and
Yeah.
fundamentally change. And the air quality in central London is so much better now than it used to be. You can really notice that as someone who cycles through that on a regular basis. And places like Tottenham Court Road, much people can actually cross the road and everything, so they can get to the shops and the restaurants and things like that. It makes a huge difference. This isn't just an urban motorway. But,
Yeah. I mean, so you are clearly passionate about this because well, that's part of your role as well. What can you just share some of perhaps projects that you have been involved specifically to enhance the cycling infrastructure
I mean, I think
where
a lot
they
of the work
were
we
put
did
in
in
place?
Barking and Dagenham, actually, which was mainly around the redevelopment of residential places, the Gascoigne estate, for example. One of the things that big focus on there was how the public realm works at ground level. So again, the proper allocation of road space, proper use of parking space. Sometimes using car parking to just gently slow down vehicle traffic. Proper provision for cyclists, both in terms of the infrastructure to move around, but also the infrastructure to keep your bike, and so proper good quality secure bike parking for people who didn't want to keep the bike in the flats. Good ground level access. And it does show you that just as proper play space, proper green space, but also proper walking and cycling space is a big part of creating a really good public realm. And you get that's the sort of the scheme on the Gascoigne estate started to come out of the ground. People wouldn't believe that it was municipal housing. They said, "Oh, you're just building expensive flats." Go, no, that's municipal housing. And part of that was because of the quality of the public realm, and walking, cycling really important in that, in terms of creating that feel where people move around. You get children congregating in an evening and everything else. So that's. And in Ealing, one of the things we did there again was with the development of Dickens Yard and the space around that, around the back of the town hall, which is an old car park actually, which staff car park, which then became a residential development. But again, proper provision on the Uxbridge Road in terms of segregated provision, and again, good walking and cycling provision in terms of parking spaces in the new developments, car club spaces as well. So it's all got to be part of a cycle hub that we put in opposite the new Crossrail station at Ealing Broadway. Really well designed, a really nicely designed piece of public realm, effectively, which was a cycle parking and then cycle parking on the green as well, so that people could cycle to the new Crossrail station, a really nice station experience, but also somewhere they could securely leave their bike with video surveillance and proper stands and everything
Exactly
like
right.
that. So
I mean, that's so important, to have the right infrastructure to put it in place that with the when you. I mean, I'm not no expert. I'm talking the expert here, but when you create those spaces that are well designed and allow people to feel safe while walking, while riding their bikes, it not only lifts their mood, but lifts the quality of the interactions people have in that space. As you mentioned before, the economic benefits that brings, but also the well-being benefits and physical benefits, not just for that community, but then to the extended parts. Because once you have a city that kind of fully integrates cycling infrastructure, walking infrastructure that allows people to do that safely.
Yeah, and it's actually better.
You are raising the value of it.
Yeah, and it's actually a better place for the motorists as well. People have to use their car, because if you can shift people out of their cars into walking or cycling for those journeys of less than 5 miles, the effect that then has on freeing up the road space for people who need to use a car or going on a longer journey or moving around, it's actually a real positive, rather than viewing it as a negative. Or they're taking away road space from motorists. Yeah, but they're enabling. And they're taking motorists off the road, because they're then able to cycle to the railway station and get the train, rather than driving to the railway station to get the train, or driving to their office or factory.
Very good. You brilliantly just said that. You brilliantly summarized that. And that's I think this is perhaps the point that needs to be highlighted here, is that by creating these spaces for cyclists and people walking, you are making the roads less congested. And that's kind of what perhaps people struggle to understand, is that, you're taking my space away, and how is it going to be less congestion if you are making more spaces?
And you might find it more enjoyable to, once you can safely and easily, you might actually think, well, actually, for me, I'd leave the car at home as well because it's cheaper and everything else. So there are, just because your existing mode is one way, there may be other real opportunities.
Yeah, and not to mention as well that at a national level, being able to implement a kind of friendlier infrastructure to cycling and walking will take away economic burden on the government, because people will have better health, and NHS will have less queuing time.
British life expectancy is going down, so we've got to do something about that. We're an overweight population, compared to many of our sort of European comparators. So there are things that real benefits from getting people walking.
Exactly. Yeah. So there is you have clearly a huge breadth of experience in a local government, and you have clearly a passion for cycling. And I wanted to slightly shift the gears, because you have been using cycling to influence the endeavors in the infrastructure at local government, but you also have used your passion for cycling to manage and own a team which called Doltcini O'Shea Continental cycling team. And I was kind of interested in, this is the kind of having a full-time role as you do have in local government and managing an amateur cycling team. It must be quite demanding. First of all, can you tell me and the people that are listening what inspired you to take on this role? What was the motivation behind it?
It's an accident, really, and it's something that got out of hand, I think is probably easiest to say. But I think the situation was that my daughter was competing at cycling as an under-16, in a youth club. I'd ended up managing one of the borough teams in something called the London Youth Games, which is like sort of the Olympics for school children, in London.
Yeah.
I'd been running the cycling team for Redbridge for some, I'd just sort of fallen into doing that. And in the UK, the sort of situation is once they get to 16 for girls, there was very little opportunities for anywhere for them to go. You were either on the national programme if you were very good and then very well supported and funded by British Cycling. But most of the adult teams didn't want under 18 girls, because of the child protection reasons and everything else. There were lots of bike shop teams, trade teams, club teams for boys, but very little for girls. And a couple of parents of other people who rode with my daughter said to me, "Oh, you can run a cycling team. Why don't you start a cycling team for them, because they've got nowhere to go?" So unwisely, I agreed, and it sort of snowballed from there, because there's a situation where we started doing this, and it's a bit like in any business, if you don't grow and continue to move forward, you end and sort of terminate. So from starting off with 6 riders in London, 16-year-old girls, we've sort of then grown and expanded and moved up and ended up as a UCI team, but largely almost slightly by accident, because we thought, we've done this, we want to do it. If we want to carry on doing it, we've got to go to the next level. So, our original thing, once we'd started, was, that cycle racing in the UK is pretty dire, really. You're either on closed circuits going round and round, or you're racing on open roads with oncoming traffic,
roads,
which I've never thought is sensible. It's not sensible. It's stupid. It's a very constrained form of activity. No one else in the world does it. It's only,
Yeah.
If you go to Europe, you can race on fully closed roads, possibly even have a crowd, and great atmosphere, big field, particularly for girls, where the fields for girls in the UK tended to be very, very small. So we always took this view. Well, we want to go to Europe and race in Europe, and so we started entering events in. So we entered some. So we found out that you could enter Nations Cup events, which are these junior competitions under 18s, mainly for national teams. But if the national teams don't take all the spaces, then club teams, which we were at the time, can take part. And I found out that the Nations Cup races in the Netherlands, particularly, Dutch club teams all entered. So I thought we might as well enter and see if we can get in. So we got in a few times, and so we were then racing against the national teams in the Netherlands, which was great experience. Difficult. First race, within the first 10 minutes, I think most of our riders had been on the floor at least once, because they're very, very full on, And another race I remember, it's one of my first experiences of driving a car in the convoy abroad. It's just like the radio just continually going, shoot, crash, doctor, shoot, and people spread all over the place. You think, Jesus, this is not, But from that sort of beginning, we then just thought, this is brilliant. We want to carry on doing this. We want to carry on.
It's funny that you were like you have all this experience of like chaos, overwhelming experiences, but then you decide, no, this is brilliant. This is what I want to do, and just
it's like
pursue
if it doesn't kill you, strengthens you. So and then we're in this position that we the existing riders we had, some of them stayed, some of them went, but most of them became 18. So we thought, well, we'll carry on as a club team, but we want to compete in Europe. So we want to race in proper races, so where you get a bit of a crowd, where there is, you can do it safely.
Some exposure more.
Yeah, well, and you can do it safely, and it's the atmosphere is so totally different from doing anything in the UK, where you get one person and a dog, and I say, you're dealing with oncoming traffic and people pulling out into the bunch and all these sort of things, which and so we competed. So we started getting in some UCI races in Europe, and it became apparent that with the sort of way the sport was changing, and particularly Brexit as well, it was getting more, in the British club not being particularly popular necessarily, that if we wanted to carry on doing that, we were going to have to step up to the next level and become a UCI team to continue to be able to ride in these UCI races. So we took that step, and we've sort of moved on from there. And we were an entirely British team. We're now a half British team, and then a mix of other nationalities. Because again, if you want to carry on getting in races, you need to have better riders. You need to have people from other countries, because it helps get in races, particularly actually if you're British, because we don't put any UCI races on in our country, so there's no degree of reciprocation between, if we let a British team in, then we'll get into a race in the UK. There's nothing like that. And also, one of our things was always that we wanted to give British riders experience of being in Europe and European racing and European culture, and obviously to have a mixed team as well. It's really interesting because it then exposes the British riders to different cycling culture, different culture, full stop. And it's an interesting dynamic in terms of a team that is drawn from lots of different countries. And I think that's really interesting. And one of the great things about cycling is that it is, it's a sport which has traditionally mixed nationalities in teams. Races move around. It's not like, it's not this focus on national teams necessarily, though, on the track, and the British tend to be obsessed with it as a national sport, where in most other countries it's not really it's a team sport, but those teams are made up of people from all sorts of nationalities. So that's
very accurate.
So that's really important to us. So that's the sort of journey that we've carried on, and have to
that's
see
important.
if we can continue.
That's interesting, because I've had on the podcast before Natasha Navin, which is the co-founder and co-owner of AG Insurance Sodal women's team, and obviously they have an elite team, but they also have under 19, under 23 team. She mentioned that you need to build from the ground up, so that, as you rightly said, from your experience from a junior level, you can't just make that leap to elite level. It needs to be few more steps that are in between those kind of the junior level to the elite level. And from what I understand, your team also uses tries to nurture their athletes to continue to study, to continue to prepare them really for a career outside of cycling, or a life that is not just tied into cycling. Can you talk a bit more about, as a team, what are the objectives of the team? Not perhaps besides, let's just focus now on perhaps on the growing the athlete, rather than what the racing objectives of the team.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've never really had particularly strong racing objectives, particularly. But I think that what our objective has been was to give British girls the opportunity to race at the highest level, whilst still being able to study and develop and build professional careers. So that they could take the choice, if they were good enough or got the opportunity, they could then go down the professional route if they wanted to. But it was to enable people to be able to ride at that top level without necessarily having to be a full-time professional and be on some national program, and continue to, it was to provide the alternative. I mean, a bit in the way that rugby union was in the UK in the 70s and 80s, where, JPR Williams, who died recently, was a very famous Welsh rugby player, in his obituary said, he used to stop because he was studying for his medical exams before the game, and that, it was to give people that opportunity, so that you didn't just have to be a professional sports person, that you could compete at the highest level, and that seemed to be the opportunity in certainly at Continental level. And when Natasha started her team, I think most of her team were students. Most of our team were students. Less so now. We've still got a significant number. We've got other people who are, in professional careers. We've got a teacher, a doctor last year who's now become our team doctor because she's retired from racing. But, and it is that, whether we'll be able to carry on doing that, or whether you get to a point where the sport changes so much, as has happened in rugby, it becomes entirely professional. And I think it's one of the challenges for the women's sport is there aren't enough levels in the sport at the moment. You've got World Tour and then Continental. Continental is a really weird mix between some people getting paid a lot of money, most people not getting paid any money. Some teams like us with a van and a car, and other teams with a lot of infrastructure. And we have to race against...
So your team, you mentioned, is an amateur team. So that means that you rely solely on sponsorships to run the team. So that's the business model of it.
We run an absolutely tiny budget. Probably Patrick Lefebvre's wine bill for a good night out, probably. But we don't pay riders. We pay a couple of staff a very small amount of money, which is but it's a real hand to mouth.
So everyone is doing it out of their own love for the sport. Really, it's kind of it's a passion project. For you, and like
no one's I'm putting money into it. Other people are putting money into it. So it's very much something we do.
I mean, I mean, it's so it's interesting to draw the comparisons because you also kind of, out of necessity and of wanting to enable your daughter into the sport, into progressing her interest into cycling, you built a team, and you kind of have carried on over the years, developing it to what it is now, competing at UCI Continental level. What from your experience have you found are perhaps the opportunities to grow the sport in women's cycling?
Yes, it's an interesting one. I think there are, at the moment, it's easy to feel fairly pessimistic, to be honest, because you've seen the top end grow, and clearly the Tour de France, and and some of the women are now making very, very serious amounts of money, £1 million a year salaries, things like that. But it's a very, very thin crust, and you're very quickly down to the level just above us, and down to our level fairly rapidly. We're riding against full-time professionals a lot of the time. There's no the infrastructure is quite weak. This year we've seen more events go. Yes, some new events appear, but a lot of races disappear. There've been some really good races.
That creates a spiral down effect where
you see,
there's less opportunities to showcase.
The big problem for women's cycling, if you're outside that world tour, heavily financed, popular, get the TV coverage, things like that. The problem for the next level down is a lack of races. And there are so many good races that come, they then go. There was a very good Mont Ventoux race, which was put on as the sister race to an existing men's race. Great course, finishing at the top of Mont Ventoux. Lasted 1 year. They couldn't get the sponsorship to pay for the race the second year. That happens all the time. There used to be the Healthy Aging Tour, which was quite a good, multi-day stage race at the start of the season. The Netherlands, they lost their sponsor, and that couldn't continue. So the big challenge is number of races. And in the UK, people will put any money into women's cycling. I mean, you get this sort of frustrating position where you approach somebody, they say, "Oh no, we can't possibly," and then you find out they're funding a men's team at a lower level. You think, well,
oh right,
and I think that's the big challenge in the UK is people who cycling isn't seen as being something particularly interesting. I think women's football is great to see it, but potentially I think it's a bit of a threat because it'll consume people, but it'll also consume potential sponsorship. So I think
I perhaps disagree with that, because with the growth of the women's football, that allows as well brands that sponsor them to see other brands that are seeing the rise of women's football, see the potential in giving visibility to women's sport, sponsoring women's team, perhaps.
Possibly, yeah. I mean, because you could take that view, and that might happen, and it might not. But if you look at what happened in athletics to a degree, that the rise of football in the UK has, both for men's and women's, drawn both participants, but also money out of athletics. The UK 20, 30 years ago, when football was slightly less dominant, it was very, very strong in athletics. And athletics clubs had reasonable crowds and sponsors and things like that, and that's they've lost a lot of that. So it's it might be helpful, but there's potential threat there as well. So that so it's the rise of just one sport, I think, is a danger in the UK. See, in Europe much less so, because football is less dominant, and there's a much more broader range of sports that attract people into them.
I mean, that is something. That I can't. I kind of. It's a lot to unpack here, because with the visibility, with that woman cycling at a lower level offers to brands, it's perhaps not immediately. You don't immediately see the results. You don't see the return in your investment, but it needs to have perhaps a shift here where brands see beyond that. But I mean, that's easier said than done.
It's the big challenge. I mean, certainly we a couple of years ago engaged with a sports sponsorship agency, and I said to them, we need could you get 100,000? They said, "Oh yeah, that's easy," because they were people who dealt with football and motor racing. And they said to me, "Yeah, people pay £200,000 for a small sticker on a racing car. They'll definitely provide that for a full team, where you get all the advantage of covering a team and all year round, rather than a tiny sticker which no one ever sees, except on." They couldn't, they came back and said, "Well, we just can't understand this. We just can't get the interest from the people in the big corporates who dish out sponsorship, because you're asking for such a tiny amount of money." Then they, other big corporates, for example, have their name on the rolling signs at the Rugby World Cup, which is millions and millions of pounds just to literally be flashed up. They said, "Oh, we can't understand it. People will do that, but they won't sponsor a women's cycling team for something which will be a tiny percentage of their marketing budget." And it's really an interesting.
So it comes down to, I guess, to the visibility, having the media showcasing women's cycling. That's the key.
And I think in
that's
the
the key.
UK,
Having the races to showcase the athletes.
yeah. And it's in the UK, it's the level of coverage which has clearly gone down. That used to be.
Oh yeah.
The Women's National Series used to be covered on, which was small, but at least it was covered on Eurosport, so you would get people dropping in to watch it. Now it's on YouTube, and you think of showing the viewing figures to a potential sponsor, and you think, oh no, I'm not going to do that because it's so low. It's just embarrassing. It's like 2,000 or something. I just think, well, that's worse than not having anything, because it just looks very poor.
Yeah. Yeah, it's sad. I mean, I remember a few years ago at club level, women coming into the club I was riding with, and the reason that they were coming was because they were seeing the women's tour, the Britain's women's tour, on TV, and they were like, "Yeah, that looks fun. I like what I'm looking at, and I want to try." And that's how they came to the club. And that, again, TV coverage gave the visibility. People felt interested into the sport and decided to try it. And yeah, that's kind of the key, I guess, which I don't have, but is how to turn, how to bring media coverage to more races so that sponsors can feel that they will benefit from having their brand sponsoring an event and putting together an event so that they can showcase.
And it's coverage in the mainstream media. Yeah, it's mainstream media coverage. If you think, sports pages, it's true in France as well, actually. L'Équipe doesn't cover women's cycling at all, really, given the detailed coverage it gives to the men's cycling. But in the UK, cycling rarely gets onto the sports pages unless, for negative reasons generally.
Exactly.
So it's a real cultural challenge. And our obsession with the Olympics doesn't help, because there is this, I think we're a bit, UK has become a bit like East Germany, because we don't perform well economically and socially, that our means of articulating our sort of national worth has become through the Olympics. So there's this obsession that money should go into track cycling because of the way the Olympics is structured. There are lots of medals to win in track cycling. There's only one medal in road cycling, and the nature of road cycling is so sort of, variable that it's hard to predict success, whereas track cycling is relatively easy to buy success because there's a small number of events, small number of countries that have the resource to take it seriously. So we see a lot of the money, most of the sports money in the UK that goes into cycling goes into that very narrow Olympic programme. So, £12 million a year or whatever it is goes into a very small number of people to get those Olympic medals, and is that the right way to run it? Possibly not,
Yeah. Yeah, it does make you think about how you bring more visibility to women's sport outside the sports such as football, or that already are big and in the mainstream media. But yeah, that's.
I think that's probably why we have to go. We have to go, into mainland Europe and compete there, because there, that cycling is bigger as a men's sport and it's bigger as a women's sport as a result. And there's more. If you go to Belgium, there's genuine interest, and people know who our riders are, even the small team. And they'll want their autographs and everything else. And that's
that must be a good experience.
Yeah, it's great. And that's
the athletes.
That's really good, because there is real appreciation of the women's sport by ordinary cycling fans. And it's true in parts of France as well. That everyone knows who all the UCI team riders are. And they it's a pain for us because everyone wants because we're probably the smallest team. Everyone wants our bottles and everything because we're the everyone's got a DSM bottle, but no one's got an AWOL O'Shea bottle or a Doltcini O'Shea bottle because we're the most obscure, smallest team. So therefore we have a collection value, which means we get mobbed a lot of the time. But, and we have to pay for the bottles as well, whereas the big teams get given the bottle. So think I've just given you €4 worth of bottle here just to.
God. Yeah, it puts even more pressure on the budget. Yeah. With this conversation about visibility and media coverage, do you think that perhaps there is opportunities to, at community level, at grassroots level, through local groups, through local cycling clubs, to help young girls, teenagers to feel more interested about cycling in any discipline?
Yeah, I think it's two things. I mean, one is, I think, if you get cycling actually more accepted as a means of transport, and therefore more people are using it to get to school. I got into cycling because I used to cycle to school.
Oh wow! I mean that's quite controversial now. Not controversial in the sense of, but in the sense that it divides a lot of opinions.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Because
I remember when my daughter used to cycle to school, and the head teacher had a thing about people not wearing helmets. So if someone's he disciplined people for cycling to school without a helmet, why? It should be safe. One, it should be safe enough, and two, they're riding on the pavement, etc., etc. So it's almost blaming the victim, rather than thinking, well, what could I be doing to? This same head teacher was obsessed with there being not enough car parking for his staff and wanted to park his car outside his office and everything like that. So, it's interesting sort of conflict. But if you had that infrastructure there and cycling to school was more, the norm, as it is in the Netherlands and even in Belgium, actually, and in parts of France, then I think more people would think of cycling as something, I can do sports cycling as well. But they're not the same. They're very, very different. But if one's got an awareness of one, then I think, you tend to get more sort of critical mass into the other. I think that would be important. And I think more of cycling being seen as a sport in school as well. I think British Rowing were really good in terms of going into schools and putting on community sports programs. British cycling less so, I think, because because of the obsession on finding the really good people for the Olympics. Rather than building a program of really promoting, grassroots cycling in schools. They do some of it, and it's not, but I think that will possibly build, awareness and interest in the sport at a lower level and more people into the sport.
Yeah.
But the big problem for girls and young women cycling is retention in the sport. If you look at, I was looking at a picture of my daughter a few weeks ago of and it was the sort of the bunch at the start of I think it was under 16, under 16 national. Just going through the field, who was still riding. And it was a bit like one of those photos of army units at the start of the First World War, and where the ones who survived are circled. And it was of that field of 45 or whatever it was, and they were the 2012, so the Olympic sort of generation, the Bradley Wiggins and all that sort of, so big sort of boom. The number's still racing. You could probably put on the fingers of one hand. It was like, that's the problem for the sport. It's the dropout rate, and the attrition rate.
There clearly needs to be more support, whether that is at club level, whether infrastructure at city level, because that I'm sure that number is the dropout level in men's is probably much lower than that. Sorry, much lower. Yes.
Yeah, I suspect so. Yeah, I think the more people probably carry on, whether they carry on competing now, don't know. But it's I think it is. And there are, all sorts of issues around, the sport and, how it caters for women, the opportunity it provides for women and girls, which are, a big challenge, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. In terms of, I think looking at the team that you manage, what what is your vision for the team? If you looking ahead, perhaps 5 years from now, how would you like to? In what position would you like to be? And
in an ideal world, we'd like to be in a position where we could ride the Tour de France or something like that. In reality, it's been able to survive till next year. That's the. If we were still going in 5 years' time, it'd be miraculous and brilliant. In real terms, I'd just like to have enough money to pay the riders a small amount of money to pay off their student loans and, for them to be able to take more time off and, and things like that. So, it's the where you'd like to be and the reality of the current situation are a long way apart. Yeah. I'd love a team where we had a budget at least be pro-continental. I think that would be the nice thing. So we had, circa £1 million budget. We could pay people properly, pay staff, and have decent infrastructure. The reality, it would be marvellous if we could just have a budget to do things better than we're doing at the moment, and just have a solid line of finance to keep us going for 2 or 3 years,
So the reality is that the team is living hand to mouth.
Yeah, it's totally hand to mouth existing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they kind of totally dependent on, again, kind of a flawed, perhaps, business model, which is the sponsorship model, where like you are relying on having a title sponsor and then perhaps a few more other secondary sponsors that allow you to run the team. And that, as we've seen from previous experiences of other teams, women's and men's, is that sponsors are not always reliable until the end of that contractual year.
Oh yeah, no, it's the problem for cycling at a lower level. Is that I do a lot of work with through my job with our local football team because we own their ground. They're a similar sort of level. They're semi-professionals. Their players all have jobs but play. But of course they've got the grounds. They've got a bar. So they can make money from people buying beers and cokes who come to the game. They get a few hundred people come to each game, but those people then buy teas, coffees, everything else, packet of crisps.
Yeah,
so the club's got an income from that. They can also obviously have a crowd, so they get £10
ticket revenues. Yeah,
so they get and they get sponsorship on top of that as well. And that sponsorship clearly is local because local businesses think, well, everyone goes to see Slough Town play, so it's worth
exactly. Yeah,
of course we compete all over Europe. We don't have a single location. We can't charge a ticket price or make money through commercial activities at the ground as you can if you're a football or rugby club. Most amateur rugby clubs survive on their bars. So that's the existential challenge for cycling. If you're not in a culture where in Belgium or some parts of France, obviously every small business and every branch of Crédit Agricole chips into the local cycling team because it's part of the identity. We're not in that position,
And especially in Belgium, since you have almost during the racing season you have races almost every week.
Yeah.
So that gives at least some degree of visibility to the sponsors because local races then attract local sponsors.
Yeah, we don't have nothing like that in the UK at all. Most of the national series or races are all the north of England. No local relevance at all. What they put on is very low key. So if I could find an alternative business model, I would. That's what we need to do. But it's very unless you can get a big you really need someone who'll fund the team. So unless you can find a very rich person who will just go, I love cycling. I want to do something for women cycling.
Yeah,
here's £100,000. You're immediately struggling. It is a sport that's just
that's an unfortunate
model.
That's I was going to say that's correct, totally correct what you just said. It's just it's unfortunately sometimes or most of the times cycling projects, cycling teams, cycling businesses even rely on people that have an immense passion for the sport and want to be part of it in some way or form. And through their own success in their careers, they are able to fund those projects, fund those brands. That's a reality that we have at the moment within the cycling space, within the cycling industry. Sorry, go on.
And there's a problem with the cycling industry as well. Is that it's not a particular. It's a very low margin industry. You've got what's essentially almost a monopolist supplier of parts in Shimano. I know in the US SRAM are big enough, but which creates a problem. You've got the industry, particularly in the UK, very, very low margins. Lots of failures. Even we can't get bikes for nothing from bike manufacturers. Which any other sport at our level, you just get given the stuff. But they're all saying, "Well, our margins are too tight. Might sponsor a World Tour team, give them bikes. We won't." And you're also squeezed to
so you have to pay for your bikes. Yeah.
So even at our level, because the industry, the global bike industry isn't really strong enough, and you're the strange situation where a retailer can say to you, I can give you the parts at trade price, but you can actually buy them at retail price cheaper from Wiggle, which is madness, and that's a failed, that is a failed business model for the whole industry, and that knocks into the sport as well because there's no, limited surplus finance knocking around. So it's a
that is tragic.
Hydra-headed challenge really for people who want to keep the teams going.
In a situation like this where the cycling industry can't help itself, I guess, through promoting the sport, enabling people to come into the sport and give visibility to itself.
The other
then it becomes a problem.
Has been the growth of the internet influencer actually. So, I've had people in the biking who said to me, "Oh, well, why do we want to sponsor a team where you've got X thousand followers on the internet and they've got 1 million, and we just give them 2 bikes?" So problem solved, isn't it? So we're competing.
Wow! So you are competing against cycling influencers?
Yeah, very, very much so. And I've had that said to me by numerous suppliers in the industry. Oh, why would we do this? Because we give so and so 6 bikes, and they get and their coverage is greater than the top women's teams, and even the top men's teams actually in lots of cases in terms of their internet followers and things like that. So that's a real existential threat from that side.
That's an interesting. I'm shocked by that because it does reveal the kind of the situation, the dire situation where you're facing, your team is facing, because content creators, influencers are able now to come in to knock at a brand's door and say, I have this X amount of people following me, I have this amount of reach. Can you give me this? And then you as a cycling team.
The sort of whole gravel bike thing is a lot of that's influencer driven. That's all this sort of gravel is the new trend, and and that competes directly against road teams, unfortunately. And it's when you add that into the sort of the endless technological innovation, where a few years ago an entry level bike you could use at high level, it was a fraction of the cost it is now because there's been so much technological innovation. So that actually the comparative price against other goods of top-end racing bikes has increased enormously, exponentially, which again puts more pressure on the smaller teams because it's that much harder to stay competitive because the whole price because cycling has become such a middle-class sport that people are developing bikes to sell to people who work in the financial services sector in the city and ride around Regent's Park. The fact they're developing a bike for them, that means it's that much more expensive for a team to access the top end technology because it's constantly evolving.
There was an interesting point as well that through my conversation with Natasha Naven, that she mentioned that it's important as well to have kind of, if riders at the junior level, at under 19 level, are not able to compete at elite level or under 23 level, but if at least they have the right support, the right staff behind them, and the quality equipment, then at least already leaves them with the degree of preparation and support that enables them to perhaps grow as a person and as an athlete. And from what you're saying, it's quite you're struggling already to at that level of giving your riders that kind of that possibility to access the equipment
top-end equipment
they can
and for women it's even
race
harder
with others.
We can't. It's very hard to get TT bikes, for example, for small women. Virtually nobody makes a TT. Very few manufacturers now make a TT bike, and a lot of them don't make them in very small sizes. Most of our smaller riders are riding TT bikes that are too big for them because they're riding the smallest bike that a brand will produce. So if you add that into the mix as well, the technological advance and the increasing sort of segmentation of the cycle industry into a leisure industry rather than from the sports side, creates other challenges as well. You'd almost think you wanted to be in a situation a bit like lower level motor racing where there's that's the basic vehicle and you have to use that vehicle, and those are so you almost stop that technological advance. Everyone uses the same bike.
I mean, you can see that in Formula One as well. There is a kind of a ceiling of what you can do.
So otherwise, it's an endless arms race, which hits the bottom of the pile. It's always struggling to catch up, and the gap between the two, between the bottom and the top, will continue to extend, and everything that goes with it.
Yeah, interesting. It's a difficult problem to solve, really, because it's some of it is perhaps out of our control, the team's control. Yeah, but at the same time, looking at the cycle industry, looking at brands, they are always chasing, what brings profit to them. And I'll leave with a question, perhaps. How can smaller teams perhaps reinvent themselves to be perhaps more flexible in the way they race, the way they reach out to partners? I don't know. It's a difficult scenario to think of possibilities that will bring more revenue to the sport.
I think what we've done has been relatively successful, because we sort of set out, look, we're going to race abroad, but we're going to attempt not to be try and mimic the big professional teams. We'll do something different on the basis that we'll look to represent the best of amateur values in a way, which is you're doing it because you love the sport, you want to do it, and you want to compete. You're not doing it to make money or to and you may well not do it for forever as a career. And I think that's a valid way to go. Whether you can sustain that long term is an interesting one. Whether that's slightly different. And our model has always been it's to compete is more important than to win. Great if we could win, but the really good thing is to be there and to get to the finish and finish in the bunch and all that sort of stuff. So again, that's that slightly different approach, which is around it's about enabling the riders to grow and develop. We don't put any pressure on our riders to get results. In some ways, in one of the real, the most unpleasant side of that, the women's sport is the pressure riders are put under to get results for sponsors. The pressure they put under around weight and all these other issues. We're in the position of not having to worry about that, because we're there to take part. If people do well, brilliant. If they don't, there's always next week. And we're not chasing those results. And I think that's a really positive and healthy. And if more people are like that, it'd be better for the sport as a whole. And I think actually that helps in many ways deal with this problem of retention in the sport and people being drawn into it, because it chews up and spits out so many people, because it is sponsorship is linked so much to money is linked to success, and you didn't get ninth, you only came 10th, and you get told off, we think you're a bit too heavy, etc., all those sort of really negative sides in the women's sport, which by going for a much more openly amateur participation approach, though at the highest level and trying really hard, I think that does possibly try and dampen that sort of negative side of cycling, which is and again that all the connotations of that obsession with results does lead into doping and everything else as well, and historically in the men's sport particularly, that was when people fighting to keep the job, to keep the salary, therefore doping to come 33rd rather than 35th, because that kept their job to pay the mortgage, and that hasn't helped in terms of that global image of cycling. It's something that people want to be involved in, so hopefully we can correct that, and the women's sport can develop a better image than the men's sport possibly had.
Well, you have said it here. You are starting, kind of the ball is rolling with you, that enabling young women to grow into athletes, but also having successful lives outside the sport, and helping them grow within a supporting kind of organization. So we kind of reached a point here where I think it's important to ask this question. And I've started this tradition in the podcast where every guest leaves a question to my next guest, not knowing who they are. So the question that was left for you is the following. How do you define success?
I think success for me is at the end of the season, the riders all going, yeah, we've really enjoyed that. We'd like to do it again.
No, that's a very good, because it shines a light through the importance of what the work you have been doing in helping these young women grow and have fun in the process.
Yeah, that's what it's all about. So, do something you wouldn't have done otherwise, experience something you wouldn't have done, but doing it through the medium of cycling.
That's very important. And that also enables as you rightly said, through the conversation, to open doors to people that see it and don't feel pressured or don't feel like it's not for them, and they can come into the sport. So I guess now is your time to leave a question to my next guest.
I think, how can we make Britain more like the Netherlands, I think would be my question.
Thanks, Pat. It has been a great pleasure talking with you, because you have some great ideas into how to make a big difference in our cities, in the sport of cycling, and you have been doing that already through your work, through the team that you manage. So yeah, I think everyone listening to this conversation will come out of it with a few nuggets that will probably change their minds about how to better include women in the sport and make our cities more friendlier.
Okay, it's great. Well, thanks, Pedro. It's been brilliant talking to you. And apologies, the light went whilst we were talking, and I'm now in the darkness. But yeah, that's not a metaphor for the decline of cycling. But we've gone from light to dark. But hopefully, we will emerge from the shadows.
Wow, there was something that struck a chord with me. The fact that teams or amateur teams are now competing against cycling influencers. That shows so much about what is wrong with the current business of cycling. I think there is place for both teams and content creators. That's not my point. My point is that the business of cycling in racing, the sponsorship model, is flawed. And Pat's tale really reveals that. Also, I think his work in local government reveals a blueprint for integrating cycling into urban planning and highlights the transformative potential of sports in fostering healthier and more inclusive communities. But before you go, please remember to subscribe to the podcast and tune in to next week's podcast, where Pat's question will be answered by my next guest. Until then, thanks for listening.